Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cyril Gittins, and I am the project coordinator and editor, Foundations Cari Environmental News Network. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today for the launch of our Convos, lunchtime Convos with Cari Bois. For those that are familiar or have attended already, are familiar with our state of the environment as well as our climate governance series, but we really envisioned to do a more compact, allow, you see, even more accessible format to make our conversations and discussions as accessible as possible. So it's something new, it's something that, of course, why not launch and learn? So for our first session, we have very honored Mr. Tazio from the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund with us this afternoon. He's going to tell us a bit more about himself as well as the Caribbean Biodiversity Network and as some of the materials that you would have seen, what I've suggested. We'll also be talking a bit about the SIDS4 conference recently happened in Antigua. But before I hand the floor over, I'm going to just give a brief background. Trying to call professional career as on the Coral Reef Ecosystem Valuation Project of the British government for Bermuda. He did where he developed incentives for local fishermen to become marine park rangers, as well as their ecological research on the management of the Shum Island Coral Reef Reserve. I hope correctly. He returned to the Caribbean to serve as the marine park manager in St. Houston. Soon after, he began his position as the director for the St. Martin Nature Foundation, instrumental in establishing the Man of War Shoal Marine Protected Area, which is St. Martin's first national park. Tazio is also the former director of the Dutch Caribbean Nature Alliance organization that supports conservation for all 6 of the Dutch Caribbean islands. He also international relations and energy management from the University of South Florida. Without further ado, Tazio, just for our attendees that are here, of course, the bio, only, but tell us a bit about the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund and what you do there.
Sure, thank you, Tyrell, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, especially an honor to be here for the first edition of Lunchtime Convos. So while we talk, I would like to wish everyone a bon appetit and enjoy your lunch. Sure, thank you for the introduction. So I am the project lead for the Sustainable Blue Finance Project, which is a global environment facility funded project implemented by the United Nations Environment Program and executed by the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, or CBF. CBF is a regional umbrella environmental fund that implements innovative solutions and consolidates regional conservation impacts for the region through a range of financial instruments. And then as a part of CBF, there are 3 programs. So there's the climate change program, which allows CBF to distribute grants directly to local, national, and regional projects using competitive calls for proposals through the EBA facility, or the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Facility. And then the second program is the Nature-Based Economies program, which contributes to the reduction of marine litter, specifically in the insular Caribbean. And this is done through the ACE facility, so the Advancing Circular Economies facility. And the program that I am a part of through the project that I manage is the Conservation Finance Program, which focuses on providing funding towards the protection and management of biodiversity and natural resources, mainly through an endowment fund, which CBF manages, but also through separate project funding. And my project specifically is done through separate project funding. So that's CBF really in a very small nutshell. Of course, it's an organization that is quite active in the region in terms of conservation financing. You know, we have various programs that we execute as part of our various programmatic, as part of our different facilities. Many of you would have noticed last week there was an environmental film festival, which was held in Jamaica, film and arts festival, excuse me, which was held in Jamaica, which got amazing participation and really focused on the synergy between environmental conservation and expression through art. So it's a wide-ranging organization. It's an organization that is spread throughout the Caribbean, although you know, with headquarters, so to speak, in Kingston in Jamaica, but it's really an organization with people who work throughout the Caribbean region. For example, I am based mostly on St. Martin, but I split my time between St. Martin and Jamaica. A little bit about my project. So my project specifically is to develop sustainable blue financing schemes or models, or develop a sustainable blue financing framework, initially for 5 project countries. So I work initially on developing sustainable blue financing mechanisms for the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Grenada. But of course, as with many programs and projects that CBF is involved in, especially those with sort of a smaller regional focus, or focusing only on a few islands, the idea is definitely to spread you know, the outcomes of the project on a more regional scale. So it ranges from, you know, developing public-private partnerships in terms of sustainable blue financing, developing innovative financial mechanisms such as, you know, investigating carbon sequestration, blue carbon, debt for nature swaps, biodiversity offsets, developing online user fee systems for accessing marine protected areas, developing banking mechanisms where certain fees go towards conservation financing, et cetera, et cetera. So my project really is focused on developing a framework for sustainable financing to support conservation management actions, initially for the 5 project countries, but definitely eventually towards the end of the project for the wider Caribbean.
Check out speaking while you but
happens to all of us.
it does. It does. So I would have, you know, given a background of some of the work that you do at the Caribbean Biodiversity, but out to me was, you know, some of the topics of like the blue economy, sustainable development, sustainable, and so you would have recently represented the Caribbean Biodiversity SIDS4 conference. So can you give us an idea of how some of those teams and would have been platformed at the conference and your role in conversation? So because I am sure that some of the conversations there would have been action.
Yeah, most definitely.
And sorry for cutting across, just for those, just a brief summary of what the SIDS4 conference is about, just to add some.
Sure. And apologies for going fast. I think we're having some internet issues, which is probably on my end, considering how famous St. Martin is for its efficient internet. So the SIDS4 conference is a conference which is held every 10 years. So the last conference would have been held in Samoa in 2014. And it is really the platform for small island developing states, although, you know, we're kind of moving away from the terminology small island developing states, or SIDS, towards large ocean states. I think that better reflects how especially the smaller islands in the region how we are very dependent on the marine environment. So the terminology is kind of shifting slowly away from SIDS, us being SIDS, to us being large ocean states. And it's really the platform for civil society organizations, governments, intergovernmental organizations, et cetera, to come together and to discuss various items, especially in terms of sustainability, sustainable development, biodiversity conservation, to come up with a roadmap or to develop a roadmap that will assist the SIDS or the large ocean states in achieving their sustainable development goals moving forward. So as I mentioned, in 2014 was the last meeting, which was held in Samoa in the Pacific. And then the conference moved back to the Caribbean, because actually the first SIDS conference was held in Barbados 40 years ago, hence SIDS4. But it's now moving back. It now has moved back to the region, which really gave us the opportunity to be, not only us as in the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, but us as Caribbean people to be front and center during the discussions in terms of, how do we see small island developing states / large ocean states develop sustainably? What are some of the pathways for us to achieve sustainable development? And then, of course, what are some of the mechanisms that will allow us to collaborate with each other in achieving those sustainable development goals? And for me, that was one of the major highlights of the SIDS conference, really focusing on collaboration and cooperation so that we can jointly achieve these conservation or these sustainable development goals. I automatically go to conservation because that's my background. But of course, sustainable development also includes, aside from natural resource protection or natural resource management, it also involves sustainable social development and the development of sustainable economies as well. So really, that collaborative spirit, especially within the region, but also within, I sat on a panel, or I moderated a panel, in fact, on deep sea mining, which also showed the need for, large ocean states or small island developing states globally to really come together and cooperate to jointly achieve those sustainable development goals. In terms of CBF's participation, it was an intense week. The delegation was comprised of myself, the CBF CEO, Karen McDonald-Gale, the Conservation Finance Manager, Tanya Liu, the other project lead that is part of the Conservation Finance team, Fabian Kine, who is in charge of the Marine Protected Areas Program, and then, of course, myself. So it was an intense week. You kind of map out the various sessions that you want to be a part of, because you have the plenary. So during the plenary, things are discussed on a very high level. A roadmap is presented, et cetera, et cetera. But the real meat of the conference are during the various side events. So I think, if my memory serves me correctly, there were about 130 side events spread over 4 days. So you can imagine, it's quite a juggling act to figure out which side events are the most effective to go to. During which side events do you have the most impact? Which side events would it be worth it for the CBF to be engaged in, whether in terms of being on a panel or moderating or giving an intervention? And then, of course, in addition to all of that, CBF also had our own 2 side events. So separately, we also organized 2 side events, one of which was organized jointly with the Nature Conservancy, which was focused on sort of framing the steps that the region should take, also in terms of collaboration on how the region can achieve its 30 by 30 goals. So, 30 by 30 goals basically means protecting 30% of, in this case, of the marine habitat by 2030, which was a very well-attended, very intense, very well, not only attended, but well engaged. There was wide-scale engagement from the community, from the attendees, in really discussing what is the best way, or how would be the best methods, or what would be the best methods for the region to achieve its 30 by 30 goals. And then in addition to that, we also organize an offsite side event, which brings with it an additional layer of complexity because you have to arrange transport, you have to arrange the venue, et cetera, et cetera. But that side event, which we did in collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank, focused specifically on sustainable blue financing, how sustainable blue financing can not only benefit the conservation management projects which have to be done in the region, but also how coastal communities can benefit from sustainable blue financial projects. Was also well attended, but again, you know, it's just, you know, it was an intense week. You know, you have various meetings to go to. We usually left our accommodation at 7:30, 8 a.m. and usually by 10:30 we were back at our hotel room. So it was busy, but I think, you know, it was fruitful. You know, the majority are, you know, the focus of these meetings, aside from the side events, et cetera, is also networking. So I think in terms of networking, we were able to really spread the word, not only of what CBF does, but definitely about the importance that the Caribbean region has globally in terms of biodiversity and biodiversity conservation, and some of the work which is being done in the Caribbean region in terms of you know, pushing the region towards achieving our sustainable development goals. So all in all, it was a busy week, but it was definitely worth it.
Definitely sounds like a busy week, but I think busy is good sometimes, especially
Yes.
when we are tackling these, you know, these issues that have existence in the Caribbean and, as you say,
Sure.
large ocean states. But not to be negative, but some of these conferences are at times fairly criticized for being talk shops, right? We have events, we have all these things. So from your perspective, and I know you mentioned that word luck because, of course, the action needed to make progress on environmental issues isn't an entity or person. So I know you mentioned collaboration. From your perspective, was there solid new collaborations or probably building and thing collaborations that came out of the conference that people could look towards in the next year? You know, this collaboration started because of SIDS and, you know, this percentage of biodiversity or rainforest was protected in a particular country, etc.
Sure. Sure. No, I mean, you're absolutely right in saying that, you know, many of these, especially larger conferences, tend to develop into talk shops. I mean, I think, unfortunately, you know, one of the clear examples of that is the Climate Change Cup, which happens every year, which, you know, unfortunately, again, has developed into, you know, a platform for talking rather than for action. I must say that SIDS, although there was a fair bit of that definitely included, I think in terms of the side events and some of the commitments which were made during the side events really will make a difference moving forward for the region. Generally speaking, out of the SIDS conferences, you have a roadmap which has been developed. So, for example, Samoa in 2014 came out, the conference produced a Samoa roadmap. And then again, as a product or as an outcome of the SIDS4 conference in Antigua and Barbuda, we have now what is called the ABAS or the ABAS, which is basically a 10-year action plan, which is acts as a guiding document for small island developing states / large ocean states to achieve a sustainable, small island developing states, large ocean states for it to achieve our sustainable development goals. And it stands for the Antigua ABAS, the Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS. Aside from that, and it is a document that, you know, which will be used, you know, under various auspices. I'm thinking about the UNESCO Ocean Decade, for example, specific focus on the ABAS document to sort of guide the Ocean Decade actions which will be happening in the Caribbean region, et cetera, et cetera. So it does act as a foundation document for guiding the Sustainable Development Principles for the Caribbean region and for all of the SIDS globally for the next 10 years. For me personally, as I mentioned, the side events and the networking opportunities, which are mostly cocktails, to be fair, in the evening. And we also kind of adjusted our agendas around the most efficient cocktail events we could have gone to in the evenings. But it's really during those side events and during the networking events where you really have the opportunity to make connections, to come up with strategies, to have discussions, to enter into engagement. It's also a smaller setting, whereas plenary, I mean, you have heads of state, the discussions usually happen on a quite high level, but it's usually during these side events and side meetings where the meat of the conference happens, really. So just to give an example, I was lucky enough and honored enough to moderate a panel focused specifically on deep sea mining. And there was a lot of involvement, especially on a high level, from Pacific Islands, so from Pacific nations. We had the Prime Minister of Vanuatu, the Minister of Samoa, etc., etc. So it did provide an opportunity for them to highlight the issues that deep sea mining will bring with it. But in addition to that, it also was a call to action for the Caribbean and for the representatives of the Caribbean to the International Seabed Authority, whose secretariat is located in Kingston, Jamaica, for them to show up to the ISA meetings, which are happening in July, so that some good decisions can happen for the region and globally in terms of a precautionary pause on deep sea mining. So that was definitely a clear action which came out. During the side events that CBF organized, the Minister for the Environment of Grenada, for example, gave an excellent intervention during the 30 by 30 session. And that has already evolved in that particular project. So the effective marine protected areas in the Caribbean project that CBF executes. For that project to, for example, use the Minister of Grenada as a champion for the region in really pushing on a high policy level for the countries within the region to achieve their 30 by 30 goals. And the same goes for sustainable financing. I mean, during the discussions that we had, there were concrete recommendations coming out in terms of communicating what the possibilities are for sustainable financing or using ecosystems as a tool for financing conservation management projects, whether it's through carbon sequestration or whatever have you. So while there is definitely a talk shop element, as always with these sort of large conferences, it is really during the side events and during the networking sessions where all of the connections and discussions for collaboration and working together, et cetera, are made. So it was a valuable conference at the end of the day.
So just out of curiosity, we picked some other attendees' attention, but I know you said that there were some recommendations for like sustainable financing. So just briefly, with the interest of time as well, and I wanna also open the floor to any other questions. But what were some of those recommendations about sustainable finance?
Sure. I mean, being in the conservation field for 15 years at least, if my fading memory serves me correctly, one of the issues that we always face is the sustainable financing for conservation actions. We have great people in the Caribbean. We have the capacity, the knowledge, but usually where we lack a sustainable method is really for the financing of conservation management projects. So that's why we really put our heads together to figure out a way in which we can, number one, protect the ecosystem, or the value of the ecosystem, protect the goods and services that the ecosystem provides, enhance those goods and services, but also through the protection of the goods and services that ecosystem provides, be able to finance coastal community projects, and also finance conservation actions. Of course, the big elephant in the room these days is blue carbon sequestration schemes, et cetera, et cetera. I know in the past, because sort of the governance frameworks and the policy frameworks, good practices, et cetera, were not properly thought out. There were some issues with greenwashing, or in this case, blue washing, which were associated with some of these blue carbon sequestration schemes. So the focus really was during our discussions to come up with a way, number one, to inform decision makers and policymakers what blue carbon sequestration, what blue carbon actually means, what the process is, what are your measurement and verification standards and reporting obligations, et cetera, and then collaborate as a region in making blue carbon sequestration schemes a possibility. For example, the Dominican Republic is doing quite a bit of work on this front. The Bahamas is also doing quite a bit of work on this front. But when you look at St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent, there's still some ways to go in terms of really making their ecosystems viable to act as blue carbon sequestration sinks. So what we're working on now is bringing all the people together, sharing best practices, running pilot programs, ensure that people know that there is a governance and policy framework associated with blue carbon sequestration. So it's really, building and of course, any project which is to be executed eventually has to turn into a program. So the hope is that in terms of long-term sustainability, for example, the Caribbean can have a sustainable blue finance hub. So one of the things that we're looking at is developing sustainable blue finance hub, which will make the accessing of best practices, but also tools, but also for financial mechanisms, make them available to the wider Caribbean. So these are some of the things that we're working on. Of course, the project just started. I've been active at the, today is actually my 6-month anniversary at the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. So we're still in the inception phase of the project. But as we go along, we will start to develop these facilities, these mechanisms to really put a focus on sustainably financing conservation projects and, quite frankly, the coastal communities that depend on the goods and services that the ecosystems provide to finance them sustainably. So that really is the goal of the project and really our focus during some of the discussions that we had at the conference in Antigua.
All right, great. So before I ask my last questions, and firstly, congratulations on years of service. Definitely, people like you, that we really cherish for the efforts that you're putting into biodiversity conservation. So being mindful of time to the time that we had promised. Before I ask my final question for the session, have any questions or comments or anything that they want to add to the of the SIDS concept, the role to add to you, and by extension, the Caribbean Biodiversity. If you need clarification on anything, you have any thoughts, to share it now. Similar to our webinars, we love to really, get the conversation going or understanding from it. Right? Well, if no one has a comment, I'm gonna question. Was anyone enlightened with any new knowledge today? It could be about anything about SIDS, the work of the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. Just one person. Why is something that we from today? So mom got scared and hopped out. I just joking, probably attacked issue. But maybe Sean, seeing you there. Did you, were you enlightened by today's session?
Good day.
Oh yes, so Dr. St. Martin.
Yeah, no
feel free
problem.
to.
Yeah, Thaddeus, thank you for that. I was wondering whether you could go in a little further in terms of you made mention of the readiness of St. Lucia, and I forgot the other island in terms of the blue. I wonder if you could go in a little further. You made that comparison to Dominican Republic, etc. Could you tease out a little bit in more detail what are the elements of this readiness that they are for? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you for your question, and great last name. Today is St. Martin's Flag Day, so congratulations. Congratulations, I suppose. No, I think it's mostly related to scale. St. Lucia, for example, has had some work done in terms of their mangrove ecosystems. I'm thinking specifically about the Macote wetland, similarly for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But one of the issues or the barriers that we keep coming across when we talk to companies or organizations that work on blue carbon sequestration is the availability of scale. The Bahamas, for example, with the work that the organization Beneath the Waves has been doing in terms of mapping out their seagrass beds, and having some of the largest seagrass meadows on Earth. Scale is not an issue. Similarly with the Dominican Republic with their extensive mangrove forests. So one of the things that we're working on is, instead of focusing on just individual islands, we're really trying to group the region and developing a blue carbon facility for the region. So that these questions of scale, does Grenada have enough mangrove forests? Does St. Vincent have enough seagrass beds? Does St. Lucia have enough mangrove forests? So in order to quell some of these questions, we're really looking at grouping the region as a whole and really using the whole Caribbean region as a carbon sequestration or building a carbon sequestration facility for the region as a whole. St. Lucia, I think, is a little bit more advanced in terms of some of the work that OECS, with the support of the German Development Bank, has been doing in terms of mapping out the potential for especially their mangrove ecosystems to act as a carbon sink. The same has to happen extensively for St. Vincent and Grenada. But again, the Bahamas and the Dominican Republic are a little bit more advanced in this process. But it's also our responsibility executing this project to provide the tools necessary to the project countries to be able to map out the potential for carbon sequestration for their ecosystems. So it's a working process, but again, I'm always a strong proponent, in fact, for collaboration and cooperation. And I think on this front, cooperation and collaboration will be critical in sort of developing these schemes and building out a sustainable blue finance hub for a region. We won't be able to do it without all hands on deck, to use a often used cliche. And I'm confident that it will happen. I'm confident that the Caribbean will transition from being a region that is mostly dependent on tourism for their economic development to a region where we really use the goods and services that our precious ecosystem, our Caribbean Sea, our terrestrial ecosystem, using those ecosystems to enhance the goods and services, which in turn will translate into a more sustainable economic development for our islands, which I think will be critical if we are to, face some of the threats that we're undoubtedly going to face in terms of the impacts of climate change. Unfortunately, it doesn't look good for hurricane season this year. So that's why, we're really putting a lot of effort, not only through the Conservation Finance Program, but also through the ACE facility for the Circular Economy Program, and also the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Facility as part of the Climate Change Program, to really make the Caribbean region as resilient and as sustainably developed as possible.
So it looks like Dr. St. Martin has a follow-up question or comment. Yes. Of course, I'll give you when we wrap up afterwards. Fantastic response.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll go ahead there. Thank you for that. Very, very interesting comments. I was wondering, because you did speak about the collective and that whole aspect, and a wonderful idea in terms of having a more integrated approach across the countries as we look at the blue carbon sequestration. I was wondering if there were in that same sense of integration and looking at the development of the countries as a whole, whether there was any deep conversation on two fronts. One, how we could integrate the blue carbon with terrestrial carbon as well. So looking at that as a holistic thing for the development. And two, what is the mechanism to allow the credits, the carbon credits, to be filtered directly to the smallholders or the persons directly involved in the activities? Thanks.
Right, for sure. Yes, most definitely. We are working on really making the linkages, also using the sort of ridge to reef or rainforest to reef methodology, and really making the link between green and blue carbon. Of course, it's going to be a little bit complicated because some countries are a little bit more advanced, especially in terms of their green carbon projects, and not so much on their blue carbon project. But we do have a specific attention focused on making the linkages between green and blue carbon. On the front of ensuring that the money trickles down, it's something that we've also been given quite a bit of cerebral attention to. For example, one of the interesting ways that the Bahamas is setting up their blue carbon sequestration scheme is through the development of sovereign wealth fund, so that whichever or whatever funding is generated through a blue carbon sequestration scheme or a green carbon sequestration scheme, whatever have you, is funneled directly through a sovereign wealth fund, and that sovereign wealth fund in turn finances activities, programs, projects, not only in terms of sustainable conservation management or biodiversity management, but also in terms of empowering communities, community-based activities, coastal resilience, et cetera, et cetera. So, with the understanding that there is a potential for whatever revenue is generated from blue carbon sequestration schemes to not find its way efficiently into communities. I mean, that's something that was flagged quite early on. We are now looking at various mechanisms, including a sovereign wealth fund, or that the money, arrives where it should arrive. I must add the caveat to that is that the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, through this project, hopes to facilitate, but eventually it will be up to the project steering committee, which by and large are representatives from government, to really make the hard decisions. To sort of approve whichever framework that we suggest to them. So that's the only caveat, but it definitely has our attention, both the linkages between the green and the blue carbon sequestration potential, and also to ensure that whichever money is generated or whichever funds are generated through a blue carbon sequestration scheme is efficiently redistributed to especially Caribbean coastal communities. I also saw that there was a question in the chat, Tara.
Yes, from Ms. Noel, I guess she was asking if Trinidad part of the process, or like playing an active role.
Sure. Unfortunately, Trinidad is not one of the 5 project countries, but as I mentioned, we will start with the 5 project countries initially, but then definitely one of the components of the project is to develop a blue carbon, a sustainable blue finance hub for the region. Because, of course—
I'm not sure if I missed it. Sorry for cutting across. I'm not sure if I missed it, but did you state the 5 countries?
Right. So the 5 countries are the Bahamas, Dominican Republic, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the Grenada. But through the development of the Sustainable Blue Financing Hub, of course, we will make these tools, these best practices available to the wider Caribbean, because it is an important way of ensuring sustainable financing once we get a facility established. And it is a question that comes up quite often, to be frank, what happened to the rest of the islands? So that's definitely something that we're keeping in mind as well.
Speaking of it again. All right, beautiful. So the Cropper Foundation, we always love to lead on a hopeful note, because this is why we do the work we do, as well as, you every fun that you do. So just to close off this session, for those among us that about the effectiveness of the current environmental projects, or this is like SIDS4 what would you say to those among us that needs to be assured that the 30 by 30 well, biodiversity framework or the sustainable development goals, that if we are not even on the right track, but we're getting there?
Sure. I think we're on the right track. I think the road for the region will be rocky and will be steep. But luckily, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have some of the brightest minds in terms of conservation and sustainable development and climate change adaptation and mitigation that quite frankly, in the world right here in our region. I don't only see cooperation and collaboration important for individual projects or even for the Antigua and Barbuda accelerated framework for SIDS, but I also see it quite essential, in fact, for us as a region to really cooperate and collaborate to achieve our sustainable development goals and to become more climate resilient. Throughout my career, I've had the pleasure to be connected with many different people from all across the region. And these are still people that I'm in contact with, still people that I lean on in terms of advice, in recommendations, if they have anything to add. And that's really something that gives me the most hope working in the conservation field within the region. How interconnected we are, how important how much importance we put on cooperation and collaboration, and how through that cooperation and collaboration we can definitely achieve sustainable development and achieve a Caribbean that is sustainably managed, not only for our communities, but also for the species and the habitat that we so depend on. So I'm always hopeful. I mean, being in this field, you're always a glass is half full kind of guy. And that's something that has really carried me throughout my career. So that would be my main recommendation, really.
I you and the entire Caribbean team for being willing to come with us. We know you all are very busy people, but I do appreciate the time and effort. And I'm sure this is the only conversation we'll be having moving forward. It's just the first. Also, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the foundation that turned out and support, whether it's tech or just supporting the event today. I really appreciate it. To the attendees, thank you for taking time from your busy day. Thank you for us. I think next time we need to have like a little lunch to everybody. Get us something to find chat and this stay tuned because we'll have information on next webinar. And I see Tadzir is putting his information in the chat. What we would is also send out an email with resources where you can email them or connect to them on LinkedIn. So please continue to enjoy the rest of your day and we will see you soon. Bye everyone.
Thank you, Tara. Bye-bye. Thank you.